Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to my office. I just wanted to say that I hope your first week went fairly smoothly. Mine wasn't too bad. And as we get into the second week and you're reading chapters 2 and 3, you might be wondering why we're getting such a broad history of persuasion in these chapters. And that answer is mainly because there's no one specific way to study, to use, to understand persuasion. In fact, if we think about it, human beings are the most unpredictable variable in the universe. We have not a lot of ways to predict what people will do. Will we avoid death? Yes, our human bodies try to do that as best as possible in most situations. Will we do some of the obvious things that our bodies tell us to do, such as fight, flight, or freeze? Those kinds of bodily reactions are a little bit more predictable because they are grounded in sort of the chemistry and the physiology of our bodies. But persuasion is not related to that. Generally speaking, it's related to whether or not someone else can convince us to do something specific, right? And that means that every time that we do a study of persuasion, we have to consider that not only is a human being producing that, but it is being received by human beings as well. And studying all of the incredible, unpredictableness is not the word I'm looking for, but since there's like zero predictability, it's really hard to do a study on persuasion that will give us a really good answer. So instead, we sort of have to come up with multiple ways of working on understanding persuasion. And there are people who want to understand persuasion as a psychology, as a concept of our psychology, of our psyche. There are others who are interested in persuasion that has to do specifically with our core values and beliefs and attitudes. There are others who are just interested in the style or mode of delivery that leads to the most persuasive message. And all of these have been questioned since we started speaking, honestly, as human beings. So if you're in my rhetoric class, you already heard a little tiny bit of this, but it's probably important for you to understand there is a distinction between rhetoric and persuasion. So instead of reiterating the book to you, which I find a little bit insulting to everybody, I would never do that to you, I supplement the book with these lectures. And so you may hear me say things in these lectures that aren't in the book. And that's because I'm trying to supplement your knowledge that you get from the book as opposed to repeating it. It's my hope that I don't say anything that's counter to the book. And it's important for you to know that there are multiple ways of thinking about persuasion. And all of those ways may be valid, probably are valid. To understand persuasion as a concept is one thing, but to understand how it works, or what effects it can have, those are different questions that we all want to ask and answer differently. So the first thing I need you to do is to just forget that there's one answer to everything, because there's definitely more than one. Now, when it comes time for testing, I'm going to be basically testing you on the reading. Did you do the reading? Which means it's going to basically come from the book. So whatever the book says goes, that's the right and wrong there. But for the purposes of our discussions and for the purpose of your learning, I hope that you'll be a little bit more open-minded, and your book is pretty open to interpretation of multiple kinds. Excuse me, can't do an hour-long lecture without drinking some water. I don't think this is going to be an hour long, but you get the idea. So I apologize. All right, so where to start? Well, let's start with some of the basic ideas that underscore, underline, and define persuasion. We know that it is a way of motivating people to change and to act. Change their minds, change their attitudes, change their beliefs, and get them to act in a certain way, buy a certain product, believe a certain thing, or vote for a particular candidate. Persuasion is a process that we go through. Okay. In fact, in your book, it has a really good sort of delineation I'm sorry, this was not in the book. This was on a website I found. It's Rhetoric versus Persuasion. It says that rhetoric is the art of using language, especially public speaking, as a means to persuade. So rhetoric is a means to persuade, whereas persuasion is the act of persuading. That comes from a wiki that was done on rhetoric and persuasion. I don't know that that's the best distinction between the two, but it's certainly one that gives us an idea that persuasion is, in fact, an act that's trying to elicit others to act, which means that as part of the public speaking process, part of the writing process, part of the communication process, all of that, persuasion is a part of that. All right, we know that. That's the easy part, right? So what's the difference between persuasion and other words that people use? One of my favorites is coercion. And the reason why I love coercion so much as a word, not as a concept, is because it's easy. You know when somebody's being coerced. You know when you're being coerced. There is a power difference or a power difference that's created by either the person who's persuading you or by your station. For example, when we work for a boss, that boss has a way of persuading us that is pretty much like, do this or lose your job. That's not persuasion. That's coercion. I mean, the proverbial gun to the head, but that is a really violent metaphor, first of all. And second of all, just most of us probably, hopefully, won't experience that. But we will experience when our parents tell us to do something, or somebody of credible stature tells us to do something, we tend to listen. But very rarely is there a coercive element to that. Where coercion comes in is with power. So as I said, your boss tells you to do something, and if you say, I don't want to do that, they say, then you can lose your job. Your choices are, not be able to feed yourself, your family, live, etc., or do what you want to do. And we all choose what we want to choose in that moment. And I don't know about you, but generally I choose to protect myself and my family, right? So it's important for us to understand that the relationship that we have, that the producer of a persuasive message, that we as receivers of that message have, is based on power. The relationship between us and them, the relationship between the audience and the speaker or the writer. All right. Where then does rhetoric fit in? I know. I get it all the time. People ask me, why do I have to take a class in lying? That's not what rhetoric is, okay? So way back in the it was the 17 to 1800s. Rhetoric got this reputation for being flowery, beautiful, stylized communication. And that anything that came as content was like incidental. It wasn't rhetoric. The content was not rhetoric because the content is based on reasoning. It's based on data. It's based on research. It's based on feelings, attitudes, beliefs, etc. It has nothing to do with flowery language. Mm-hmm. And, some of the definitions of rhetoric that you read today are that way as well. Whenever we hear the presidential's rhetoric, we tend to think negatively about whatever follows. But that's not its original intent. So again, those of you in my 350 class, let's do a quick review of last week. Rhetoric began, or our understanding of rhetoric began around 500 BCE. And in 400 BCE, roughly, Aristotle gave us a real definition of rhetoric that is useful. And that definition of rhetoric is the ability or the skill or the art of knowing in any particular instance all the means of persuasion. So while some people see persuasion as a part of rhetoric, some people see rhetoric as a part of persuasion. Aristotle tells us that understanding all the means of persuasion, including, by the way, that power relationship, is key to understanding what's happening in the communication process. And that is rhetoric. Now, does that sound confusing to you? Probably. If I asked you a question right now, what's the difference between rhetoric and persuasion based on what I just said, would you be able to give me a really good answer? Probably not. But that's not the goal today. The goal is to start thinking about the differences between persuasion and other types of communication. You may find there's very little difference. Some of you say, well, obviously there's a difference. I don't know how many of you have ever bought furniture from IKEA, but the directions from IKEA are anything but persuasive, right? Except here's the thing I learned. If you put together a piece of furniture from IKEA the way you think you should put it together, it's going to be very different than the way they tell you to do it. And more than likely, your version is not going to turn out nearly as strong or as well, or possibly not even looking like what it's supposed to look like, because IKEA and whoever writes their directions has figured out the best way to put this piece of furniture together. So in a way, those IKEA directions are persuading you to build this piece of furniture correctly. And that is actually persuasion. When you think about persuasion that way, all of a sudden, everything becomes persuasive. Let me give you an example that I dealt with today. This is a light bulb, right? We have a lot of these in my house. I don't know what they are. I was lucky I understood wattage when I was a kid. Now I'm supposed to understand lumens and all this other stuff. I'm looking at it like I can see it. I don't have my glasses on. But what I do know is that I had 3 of these bulbs. I couldn't tell the difference between the 3. And so I had to pick them up and read them to know that the equivalent on this is 20 watts. And the equivalent on another one was 60 watts. And so in that, I knew that I wanted the brighter light. So I put the 60 watt bulb in. Is that stretching the definition of persuasion a little bit? Perhaps. Because it's not telling me, hey, use the 60 watt bulb. But the implication is if I want a brighter bulb, I need to use the 60 watt. Everything that we experience can be seen as persuasive. I'm not suggesting that it should, but it can be seen as persuasive. And that's why when we tell you to critically think about the things around you, we're talking about everything. The movies that you see, yes. The advertisements that you see, yes. The things that you read, absolutely. News, 100%. Whatever it is. The unfortunate thing for us is that we as a humanity has just gotten to the point where we believe everything that we are hearing is either a complete and utter lie or absolutely true. We don't take the time to consider that some of it might be true and some of it might not be. It might be slightly true or not even slightly, maybe a little more than slightly true. It's difficult. Did you ever hear somebody say the old adage, every lie has a kernel of truth? That's absolutely the case, because if you want to lie about something, you need to know what the truth is before you can make up the lie. That's the great thing about lying. The other part of that is very simple, that people won't believe a lie if it has absolutely no basis in reality, the truth, or their experience. Okay? The unfortunate thing for us nowadays, too, in addition to that, is that we have something that we call fake news. I know I know you guys think that word came up in like 2015, 2016. It did not. It's been around for a very long time. It's had so many names as a concept. Fake news, biased news, inaccurate news, sponsored news. What else have we called it? Oh yeah, incorrect news. We have had so many words for it. The thing is that these days, telling the difference between real news and fake news is difficult. And it became difficult over the last, the last 5 to 7 years or so, because we have allowed ourselves to read satire and believe it's true. And you know what? That's not new either. Way back when Ireland had a famine, and England had overpopulation of children who were in orphanages, a writer named Jonathan Swift took up his pen and said, "Hey, I've got an idea. Let's solve this problem easily by sending all of the children to Ireland and eating them. We solve the hunger problem and the overpopulation problem." Now, is that horrifying? Of course it is. And some people thought it was true. Some people thought he was actually advocating for that until he missed the point, which was, this is how ridiculous the debate has gotten. Why aren't we focusing on the things that are important instead of worrying about the things that are not important? Satire in today's version is like news from The Onion, which I know is passé, but I still love reading it sometimes when I have time. Any news from The Onion is simply untrue. Where I knew I was in trouble as a communication scholar was one day when I read something and thought, oh, that's hilarious. That's from The Onion. That's great. It's got to be. Or from some similar satirical work. And it wasn't. And then I realized that we cannot become complacent in receiving messages, that we must actively think, critically think about the messages that we receive all of the time. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it exhausting. So you know what? Instead of practicing that right now, let's get better at it by understanding it better. And that's what this course is designed to do. Your first 3 chapters give you a history of persuasion and how we come to study it and why. And that's great. It goes through the history of persuasion as argument, and then it talks about persuasion in scientific discovery, and which is fantastic, by the way. And then it talks about yellow journalism and propaganda and all of those bad things that follow the word persuasion sometimes. And during the late 1700s and early 1800s in this country, all of our newspapers were sponsored by political parties. There were essays written by people with pure bias for the Constitution, against the Constitution, for the Revolution, against the Revolution, etc., etc. These were not small things. These were huge issues. So newspapers at the time, there was no, we're going to be unbiased, we just tell you the facts, that's it. That did not exist. It wasn't really until the 1960s, when we had the crisis with Nixon, that the American people started to truly distrust the government. And, well, the media is the watchdog of the government. It makes sense that eventually we wouldn't believe anything we hear in the media either. And so if we don't believe anything that we read, hear, watch, etc., then what standards do we have for agreement? And the answer is we don't. And now I've just explained why democracy can fail very easily. I know, it was simple. Just kidding. It's a little more difficult than that. But the idea of the core of that is the same. if we stop believing that there is some agreed upon truth, then we are all in big trouble. I don't just mean our government, but just as human beings, we're in trouble. Why do we know that? Because we know that in order to move through the world and to progress in the world, we have to be able to communicate. And that requires us, let's go back to the beginning, that requires us to believe the information that we receive. So persuasion then requires us to question the message. If you want to understand whether or not something is true or not, we have ways of doing that. But persuasion, as some people will tell you, very rarely has anything to do with the truth. We're not trying to determine the truth when we're persuading each other. We're trying to convince you of it. So, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something obvious here. If I tell you that the sky is blue, you can say, no, it's not, and both of us would be right. How is that possible? Because this gas is colorless. It just reflects the earth. And most of the time, most of the earth is blue because it's covered with water. And when you have a clear light reflection and a clear against another clear light reflection, you end up with this blue color based on what the majority of the earth is made of, which in a way is kind of cool. Makes us both right. Very rarely can we be right and it be okay. But even in something as simple as what color we're seeing when we walk out the door is, in fact, debatable. It's a question of fact. Is it or is it not blue? It's both. The amazing thing about the study of persuasion is that it has built to a point where we study persuasion a multitude of ways. We essentially follow the four major paradigms that we have in the communication field. Those major paradigms are the post-positivist, the humanistic or interpretivist, the rhetorical, and the critical, and then finally the postmodern. Now, the extremes, like postmodernism says, in the extreme, postmodernism would suggest that none of us can understand each other because there is no shared meaning. There cannot be an agreed upon meaning because there's no agreed upon truth. Now, most postmodernists would say that's going a little far, and they're right. That's not exactly what is meant, but the idea of there being multiple interpretations of the same experience, that's not crazy at all. That makes sense. How do you study that? I have no idea. Where on the other end of that spectrum, the first paradigm I mentioned, post-positivism, says that we can know exactly what persuades and does not persuade. All we need are some scientific studies to prove it. Well, we tried. We tried biometrics. We've tried putting people into realistic experimental situations. We even have perception analyzers. We have one at the school, actually, where we can have people sit there with a little dial telling us when they're being persuaded and where they're not being persuaded and how they're feeling based on what they're watching, literally moment to moment. Well, that word doesn't work. That word definitely works. People resonate with that thought. They don't resonate with that thought. One time I was working with that particular piece of equipment, and I was working with a friend of mine from NYU and a friend of mine from Northeast College in Illinois. And they were doing a study on race and political ads and how people are persuaded based on race and messaging. And I was a little bit skeptical, I think, but I had the equipment, so I got some credit, which is nice. But I helped them set this up. I ran the studies for them, the experiments for them, and then they wrote up the studies. And it was interesting because they made some claims that we felt were solid. That people reacted more negatively to people not of their their color, their ethnicity, their race, their background. For example, I happen to be, I don't know if you can tell, a white Italian chick, okay? Partially Italian, not fully. Whenever I watch these commercials, I happen to be biased towards white white Italian women or white Italian men. Now, I don't know about you, but there aren't a ton of Italian men or women running around talking about running for office or any other gender. Most of the time, you don't see them saying, "Hi, I'm Italian." Color, on the other hand, is something that we can't avoid. And so my bias, of course, I mean, it's a slight bias, but I did take the test. We all have some sort of way of thinking about the world, which means we filter messages through our perceptions. But that's neither here nor there. Interesting study. Was it a study of persuasion? I guess. A study on persuasion, definitely. Was it completely accurate? I mean, for the people that we tested, I'm sure it is. But we got a really interesting response from a reviewer once who said, what happens, how do you know that when they turn the dial, that they're turning it at the moment you believe they are? Doesn't it take a second to process that word before you can then take a second to respond? And I sat there going, oh my God. I mean, we have this technology that tells you how people are feeling at that moment, but they're not wrong. What if I did that whole study and found out that, I don't know, the word economy really turned people off? So I advised my political candidate, don't use the word economy. Let's think of other ways to say it. And then it turns out that it wasn't economy that they had a problem with. It was the word inflation. It was just that they didn't get to the dial fast enough. Our responses as human beings are a little bit behind the real-time moment. And I was like, wow, that's a good point. But this is one of the problems that happens when we try to scientifically and positively identify what's going on in human beings, particularly when it comes to persuasion and any kind of communication, really. So the post-positivists are on an extreme scientific, like controlled experimental sort of model. The postmodernists are sort of the, let's all have a different view of it because we do anyway. And they're not completely wrong. Neither of these are completely wrong. But in the middle is usually where most people who study communication land. Either the interpretivistic, humanistic point of view, that there are potential interpretations for messages of all kinds, communication of all kinds. That does not mean that you can't study that using social science methods. For example, my moment-to-moment race study using the perception analyzer can be used to talk about the perceptions, the multiple perceptions that people have in differences in race in political ads. Very, very possible. I can also do more of an interpretive work and perhaps do in-depth interviews or focus groups to ask people how they respond to race in political advertisements. And I can also use a critical perspective to think, what kind of power situation are we creating with our political ads when they are based on race or color? So we have multiple ways that we can study the phenomenon of persuasion. Do you have to choose one of those? Not necessarily. Some of the assumptions, behind them are antithetical to each other, but not all of them. And it's not my job to persuade you to study persuasion one way or another. But the book takes on setting up the foundational sort of rules and regulations that we've had in, I'm pulling up my book, I apologize. I can't get used to this whole everything's online thing yet. I know it's easier and cheaper for everybody, but I haven't quite gotten there yet. So what you've studied is so far is, aside from just hearing us talk about where persuasion comes from, which you've probably heard 5,000 times in your career, you've also learned a little bit about the key foundations and the historical, scientific, and ethical foundations. Let's talk about that for one more minute. Scientific, ethical, historical ways of studying persuasion is more about the focus of your interest in questioning persuasion and how it works. Let me explain what I mean. Can you ask a scientific question about persuasion? Yes, you can. You have to follow the rules of scientific discovery in order to answer a question like that, but it can be asked. The historical perspective sort of says, what do we know from the past, and how will that predict what's going to happen in I don't know, say, my study, okay? But finally, the ethical perspective is really important, because far too often people say, oh, propaganda, we know that's not ethical. Oh, coercion, we know that's not ethical. Yellow journalism, that's not ethical. Great. But what if I happen to think that using social science method, or a scientific method like the moment-to-moment study I was just telling you about, is the wrong way to study race and politics? What kind of question am I asking if I say, I don't want to study race and politics from that perspective? And the answer is an ethical one. It's not just that there's ethical behaviors and unethical behaviors, but there are also ethical ways of studying persuasion and understanding persuasion through ethics. That sounded more confusing than I thought it would. Your book is going to identify in some of the chapters that we're about to read what each of those means and how they work. We're going to start with, next week in chapter 4, we're going to start with that sort of historical social science or scientific perspective, post-positivist perspective of understanding attitudes and beliefs. And attitudes and beliefs is understanding attitudes and beliefs, the difference between the two and how we change them that leads to action, is the, I say, oldest way of studying persuasion from a social scientific point of view. People realized a long time ago that if you want to understand whether or not persuasion is working, you have to understand whether or not it can change attitudes, beliefs, actions, etc. So there's about 3 chapters on that, I believe. Yeah, going all the, well, no, there's like 4 chapters on it. 5 chapters just on attitudes, beliefs. So it's going to take us a while to sort of go through that, because we don't just need to understand where they come from or how to change them, but we need to understand how to study them. That helps inform our ability to practice ethical persuasion. So here we go. These 3 chapters, very generic, very general, I should say, not generic, but very general, very broad. The next 4 or 5 chapters are going to be extremely specific. So pay attention to those. And I will separate those out in lectures so that we can focus really, really closely on each of the chapters and the concepts and ideas in those chapters. In the meantime, I will assign another discussion board on Friday, because I don't want to do it when you have one that's due on Friday. So I'm not going to overlap those. So you can be on the lookout for that. And today is Wednesday. You still have 2 days to complete the discussion board assignment if you haven't. And other than that, hopefully I've been responding to you all via text, email, or message board, and I will continue to do that. And you all stay safe. I'll look forward to reading the rest of the discussion board. If you posted already, I read it. I may have responded to you. I may have just given you a grade. But those should all be completed by me at this point. And I'll just wait for the rest of them to come in, which I'm very excited to read them. You all have some fantastic ideas and sort of make me think sometimes, because I mean, I forget how anybody else thinks about persuasion but me. And we all sort of fall into that tunnel vision, and we don't want to. So we need to pull ourselves out of it. And one of the ways that we're going to do that is by understanding how to study or question persuasion as a concept, and the techniques of persuasion and the outcomes of persuasion as they are. All right, I will see you all probably next week on video. Otherwise, let me know how you're doing. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll be talking to you soon.